Good day, dear students. Welcome to our first topic for our subject, EL111, the Children and Adolescent Literature. So for our first topic, we will have the Introduction to Children and Adolescent Literature, its definitions, and history. Now, why is it important to know the history of a certain thing? We are talking about literature and we are talking about literary pieces. So for this topic, we will be discussing first the history of children's literature. Like how did it evolve? Why did it come to life? And what were some of the contributions in the past which made children's literature grow in the present? So, what are some literary pieces introduced to you in your childhood? May it be stories, poems, songs, nursery rhymes, and even famous series or books. So, I think here are some of the most famous literary pieces that were introduced to us in our childhood. We have Dr. Seuss stories, Cat in the Hat, Green Eggs and Ham, and others. We also have the Alice in Wonderland. These are some of the classic books, which I think some of you have read. These are actually fairy tale or classics fairy tale or fairy tale classics. And we also have a poem. I think this is very familiar to you. The All Things Bright and Beautiful poem that is almost recited in our elementary years. And we also have the Harry Potter series and also the Chronicles of Narnia. These are just some of the literary pieces, texts, or books introduced to you in your childhood, but I know that there are also some stories shared to you by your parents and grandparents which are not written in books. So, the objective for today's topic are first to identify the persons and events in the history that contributed to the development of children's literature and to construct a timeline or graphic organizer showing the development of children's literature and young adults literature in the world and in the Philippines. Take note, class, that following the uploading of this topic or this video or pre-recorded video is the assessment or the assignment that will be assigned to you later on, that will be given to you later on, and you're going to answer that for the whole week. So let us proceed. Now, before we will proceed to the history of children and adolescent literature, let us define first what is children's literature. Why do we only define it as children? Because generally children and adolescent literature are have in common, and that is to have high literary standards that is provided for readers or young readers with, of course, the understanding and the knowledge of the writer and its purpose on the message of every text or pieces provided to the young readers. So, children's literature is the good quality written work with the purpose of entertainment and information intended primarily for children from birth to adolescence. Why it's from birth to adolescence? Because we know that in a very young age, we are already introduced to certain stories, even very short stories by our parents. So it started from the birth of an individual to adolescence. It covers topics of relevance and interests to children that appropriately reflect the experiences and the realms of childhood through prose, poetry, and fiction and nonfiction. So these prose, poetry, fiction, and nonfictions are actually genres of literature. So we will be discussing them or reviewing them later on because I believe that you already have the idea of these terms. Okay? So, children and adolescents literature tells children's and adolescents' special literary texts. So, in short, these texts or these literary pieces are intended for them, which gives them enjoyment, information, entertainment, and even lesson. So, this kind of literature includes a part of the popular and oral culture, such as lullabies, parables, stories, and as well as stories that plays and poems and writings in the fields of religion, social science, science and its application, and the art and entertainment. So, these are the definitions of children's literature. In short, literary pieces are intended for children or young readers, written by authors or shared by individuals to give information in the different fields. So it may be through lullabies, parables, stories, plays, and even poems. Now, how important are these literary pieces to children and adolescents? So, what do you think is the importance? Why it's important to introduce such pieces to our children and, of course, to the adolescents or to the young readers? First, of course, is it helps them to better understand themselves, others, their world, and the aesthetic values of written language. So, it gives us the understanding of our own existence, to our world, and of course, to the people. How? Because the moment we read such text, then it gives us information. It gives us the feeling of either excitement or fear or being sad or being able to know something. Okay? Then it assumes the role of one of the characters. One very good skill that is developed in reading literary pieces, especially children and adolescent literary pieces, is that we make our imagination grow. When we read a story, we try to assume ourselves as the character in the story, or we when we read a poem, then we try to assume our feelings as the feelings in the poem. Next is we also have through that character's thoughts, words, and actions, the child develops insight into his or her own character and values. So it is very clear that in some literary pieces provided or shared to us by our parents, our teachers, as young readers, I think you've experienced this also, that it gives you lesson. It makes you reflect on the character in the story and in your own deeds in what you do. So it develops child's insight into his or her own character and values. Like for example, the fable, um these kind of literary pieces talks about lesson on what should you do and what should you not do. Okay, and then it frequently, or because of experiences with literature, the child's modes of behavior and value structures are changed, modified, or extended. Now, of course, it depends on the literary pieces. We may change our behavior because we follow certain characters in the piece, or our moods may change. Um, Depends on the theme in the piece, or depends on the tone of the piece. So it may be modified and even extended. Now, how did the history of children's literature evolve? A knowledge of the historical background of children's literature through the ages helps us understand the forces affecting the development of children's literature and their characteristics at different periods. So, the development of children's literature reflect the spirit and interests of each period. Now, let us proceed to the early beginnings. So, before the invention of the 15th century of the printing press, which made books more widely available, children only listened to stories told by their elders or their parents. And this is in general states that the characteristics of the earliest children's literature were presented through oral storytelling. So that's the very first um, discovery of children's literature, but there were no certain structures yet. Only told stories from parents to their children. So these stories were about the adventures of older people, about animals, and even imaginary characters. Later on, you will know what are these stories all about in the development of children's literature in the Philippines. We actually have a term for that. But let us proceed first. So these stories were passed on by word of mouth from generation to generation before they were collected for printing. So there was no printing press yet at the time. Children understand and comprehend and of course remember stories from their parents through communication or through oral storytelling. The next period came the classical world. So in early times, Western civilization has its roots in the cultures of ancient Greece and Rome. So obviously for this classical period or classical world, two group of people or two groups were actually prominent, the Greeks and the Romans, so which flourished between about 500 BCE and 400 CE, now known as the classical period. So Greece in the 5th century BCE is in many ways the birthplace of Western culture, and so it is where our story also begins. This is actually the earliest written in the history of the world where development of literature actually flourished during the Greeks or the classical period. In this cradle of democracy and individualism, children grew up with the stories of Trojan War. So during this time, I think some of you are familiar with the stories of Trojan War. That's from Homer's Iliad, and of the travels of Odysseus from Homer's Odyssey. It's even translated nowadays into movies, right? And the stories of Jason and the Golden Fleece and the adventures of Hercules. So they also knew of the now famous fables attributed to the slaves Aesop. This is another one. This is one of the most famous kinds of literary pieces in the past. During the classical world, it's the development of the Aesop's fable, which is written by a former Greek slave in the late to mid 6th century BCE. Aesop's, his name is Aesop. So uh, these are fables that are the world's best known collection of morality tales. So I think you're familiar with fables, which has a character of an animal but is pertaining to certain characteristics, whether right or wrong. So the fables were originally told from person to person as much for entertainment purposes, but largely as means for relaying or teaching a moral lesson. So this is what I have mentioned earlier. So with the decline of Greek civilization, the Roman Empire rose to power, but the Romans remained under the long shadow of Greeks whom they greatly admired. But the power of these ancient stories remain with us, and modern writers and illustrators frequently turn to the Greek and Roman myths for inspiration and retelling. That is why, if you have heard some literature teachers, they always start with the history in the classical era. Okay, so the next period, the Anglo-Saxon period. So the Anglo-Saxon encompasses literature with Anglo and Saxons or the Old English during the 600-year Anglo-Saxon period of Britain from the mid 5th century to the Norman conquest of 1066. I think you have discussed this one in your linguistics of English if you're already done on the development of the English language, which is somewhere in Europe, where there are conquests happening in the past, and this Anglo-Saxon group were the first people or were the first period where English language or the development of English language also flourished, as well as the children's literature. So it's part of the periods in the history of children's literature. So these works include genres such as epic poetry, biogra- uh, biography, and even sermons, Bible translations, legal works, chronicles, riddles, and others. So in all, there are about 400 surviving manuscripts from this period during the Anglo-Saxon period, and a significant corpus of popular interests and specialists' research. So one of the most common or famous writer before we will have the famous writers. So as far back as the Anglo-Saxon period, or monks and other learned men wrote lesson books for children. These lesson books were designed for teaching, and the first man to write the lesson books for children was Aldihelm. Aldihelm is the first man to write the lesson book for children. Examples for this are his De Septenario and Demetris Enigmatibus, Actedum Regulis, and these contain the meaning and use of number seven in the Bible, riddles and puzzles in Latin which children were asked to solve. So I am not so familiar, class, with the different write-ups of Aldihelm. What is most important here is we know him as the first contributor during the Anglo-Saxon period who write the lesson books for children in the purpose for as a purpose for um, solving puzzles and even Bible lessons. So the most famous write up during this time is the story of Beowulf. Who is familiar with the story of or the poem? It's actually a poem translated into a story from the time of the Anglo-Saxon period, and it's also translated into a movie. And the piece is it begins it's actually a poem, diba? As I mentioned a while ago, it originally written as a poem, and it begins with the history of the Danish king, starting with Shield, whose funeral is described in the prologue. So the idea of the story of or the message of the poem Beowulf is it's all about a certain leader, and leading up to the reign of this leader or this current king, which whose name is Hrothgar, Shield's great grandson Hrothgar is well loved by his people and successful in war. So it's more on a war, civilizations, and the coming of the different colonizers. So he builds a lavish hall. Hrothgar builds a lavish hall called Heorot to house his vast army. However, Grendel, a monster in human shape who lives at the bottom of the nearby swamp, appears at the hall late one night and kills 30 of their warriors in their sleep. Then here comes the Dion Beowulf. So it's one of the most famous works from the period of the Anglo-Saxon that include Beowulf, who became the which became the highest achievement of all English literature and the earliest European vernacular epic. So I have seen the original piece of Beowulf. It's actually written in the vernacular terms during the Anglo-Saxon era, but we already have the English translation of this, still the Old English translation for this, and you may search this one and try to read the whole story of Beowulf. So it talks about a hero who's named Beowulf who killed all the who killed the monster named Grendel. Okay. So if you are curious enough of the story, you may search the synopsis for this in the internet. So that's one of the most famous piece written during the Anglo-Saxon period based on the true story. Then here comes the medieval period. So in the Middle Ages literature class, it aimed at the young reflected the generally accepted view that children were born sinful and in need of redemption. So, by the 15th century, books on manners and morals began to appear in England by 1430. One of these was William Caxton's Book of Courtesy, published about 1477. Another was the Baby's Book, which had the subtitles Mother and Meals in the Olden Time. So, this book contained rules of behavior for boys who trained to become knights during the age of chivalry. So, it is possible, class, that the shift back to books of explicit moral instructions was partly aided by technological developments. And vast improvements in printing and illustration meant that moralistic literature could more easily be made to appear appealing to children, and a variety of chapbooks featured in the exhibition illustrate this. So, one of the most important person or contributor during the medieval period is William Caxton. So William Caxton class is the first person to introduce printing press and publishing in Westminster. Since this is this medieval period or during this time, The main purpose of writing literary pieces or children's pieces is to provide information, to provide guide to children, give them the rules and behavior, and train them to be individuals, especially for boys who fight for their places or for their environment as knights. So William Caxton introduced the first ever printing press in Europe during that time, and even published two of his books, the Book of Curtaise. Um, this is the one I mentioned a while ago, and the other one is the Book, which is the manners and meals in the olden times, and it contains rules and behaviors for boys. So since this during this time also during the medieval period, it's also otherwise called as the age of chivalry, where boys, especially or men especially, are trained to become knights to protect their places from expedition, from colonization, and from anything um, um, that helps them or that provides them the skills to protect their own area. So we also have one contributor I have not mentioned here. I have not placed in more in the presentation, but we also have one contributor during this time, this medieval period, and he is John Locke, known as his principle for thoughts about concerning education. So before the idea of John Locke about his concern for education, there was a theory about a certain individual that a certain individual is a blank slate. That means tabula rasa, or all of us now we are actually blank individuals who needs to be educated, who needs to be filled in so that we will learn something. Until the time of Locke, that was actually contradicted, because Locke believes in the idea that education can help individual grow and learn things. So he went to Westminster, or John Locke went to Westminster and thought or and created the books, or written some books and principles on his idea about education as one of the important factor that can help an individual learn or grow. Okay, so the ABC book, some of the pieces or some of the tools or the printed materials provided during these times are the ABC books. The first one is the ABC books, then we have the horn books and the chap books. So let us have first the ABC books. It is also known as the primers, which were used at the hour of prime as a book of private devotions in the Anglican Church. So why it's called primer? Because these are, again, what I mentioned a while ago, it's a book of instruction, right? Guide. It's a guide. That's the right term. So Henry VIII had ordered the printing of both Catholic and Protestant primers that contained the alphabet and Christian principles. Thus, the term primer came to be applied to all the first books for children in school. So this is actually the first term for the first books of children used in school. That's the word primer. So the ABC books includes the the alphabets and um, the alphabets and the first lesson provided to children. And the next one is we have the chap books, or the no, sorry, the horn books first. So the horn books, which were not really books, appeared toward the end of the 16th century. These were the first books designed for children to handle. So if we have the primer as the first ever book provided to them, it was developed to a horn book. It's something that they hold, and it's like, just as you can see in the picture, it's like a paddle that where the writings are there, and then it was used to teach the alphabet and combinations of letters and to continue religious instruction. So as you can see there, capital letters followed by vowels and their combinations with consonants were printed across the top. It's on the top part. And then the Lord's Prayer was printed at the bottom, because their means of writing children's literature is not for entertainment yet, but for instruction and for rules. or for behavior, changing of behavior. So the paper used for this is covered with transparent horn. That is why it is called horn book. Okay, and was held in place by metals like silver, brass, or copper. So these books could be hung around the neck of the children. It's just actually a small one. Next is we have the chapbooks. Chapbooks, in 1697, Charles Perrault, or a Frenchman, published his collection of tales entitled Comtesse de ma Mère, El Oye, or the Tales of My Mother Goose. And these were written in chapbooks. So translations of these tales were published separately in chapbooks in England. So what are chapbooks? So these are actually single sheets of paper, in small sheets of paper, maybe 1/8 or 1/4 of our new paper today, printed on one side. Only cold broadsides were only the broadsides were issued. So murag ang summary lang nga part ba. So but the chapbooks were the write-ups were printed on both sides, and it contains the ballads of the first chapbook actually was created, and it contains a ballad of Robin Hood. So these were called chapbooks, class, because they were sold by itinerant peddlers called chapmen. So mura siya ka na bitang gagmay nga leaflets, you call them leaflets or flyers. Chapbooks are actually that like that. And thin lang siya, yung width dili siya baga, and then mostly were provided to children for also for instruction and for learning. Okay, so those are some of the tools for write ups that were invented during the that were developed during the medieval period. Then let us proceed to the Puritan period. If we talk about Puritan, class, the word Puritan means to, still related to the medieval time, means to um influence people with belief about being sinful, and we have to strive to follow the rules and the commandment in order for us to be saved. So we deserve, according to the Puritan time, the idea of a human that is deserved to die unless being saved by God. So that the main instruction, or the main lesson moral in the time, is to follow God's will and strict moral code. Okay, so the Puritan period, during this period, the book stressed for the fear of God, because of course we sought to follow God, and we are sinful as individual, just carried upon in the during the medieval time until this time. So the religious instruction and preparation for death. So what are these? It's mainly for this. It mainly stressed in the fear of God, the religious instruction, and the preparation for the death of a human being. So children read books that interested them, although the books were for adults, like John Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, and Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travel, and the Mallory's Death of King Arthur, Reynald the Fox, and the Aesop's Fable. So these books are actually not yet to entertain them, class, to entertain children, but simply to provide lesson or idea about how we follow God, and what would happen to us if we do not follow Him, or we do not follow His will. Okay, so it merely provides lessons or less moral codes that should be done by an individual in order not to die mercilessly. Hmm. Okay, so some of this, what are those? Some of the pieces. We have John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, and we have Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe, and we have the Gulliver's Travel, and we also have Sir Thomas Malory, or the death of King Arthur. Then we have the Reynard the Fox, and the Aesop's Fable. I'll give you some of the background of these different books later on, class, when we'll proceed to the different stories already, or the different pieces. So let us also discuss now the tool that is developed during the Puritan period. So we have what was called the England or the New England Primer. What's the New England Primer? I mentioned to a while ago that the first book printed for children is the primer, right? Primer book, which was originally written in Latin and German, but was later on translated by by a translator, uh, with the use of English language or the Old English language. So the New England Primer, which is the first primer book during this time, Puritan period, is made especially for the children of the American colonies. And it was a small book, which is about 3 by 4.5 inches, and had about 100 pages. So this time, compared to chapbooks, nga flyers lang ang ihang dating, this time it is now really a book. It contained the alphabet, words and syllables for spelling lessons, and the Lord's Prayer, catechism, hymns and verses, rhymes for each letter of the alphabet. We also have the first invented picture book. So, since in the past, wala pa to ang mga picture books because mostly are texts. In 1658, the first illustrated school book appeared, which became the first picture book. And this was written by Johann Amos Comenius, the Bishop of Moravia, and the educator who believed in teaching children by letting them see things with their own eyes. Now, I believe that we learn things better when we see them through our eyes, not just the texts that we read. You will be encountering that later on, that kind of theory later on in the principle of Dale's cone of experience, that the the information is retained longer when you see pictures or even hands-on experience rather than simply reading texts. So that is created by Comenius, the first picture book, which is called the Orbis Sensualum or Orbis Pictus, simply called Orbis Pictus, the world in pictures. So it's the first ever picture book created during the early beginnings in the history of children's literature. Now let us proceed to the next period, which is the 17th and the 18th century. So the 17th books in the 17th century class stressed on religion, still on religion and morals due to the rise of Protestants. In 1715, Dr. Isaac Watts published Divine and Moral Songs for Children, a companion volume to the New England Primer. So some of writers considered Isaac Watts as the starting point of the history of children's literature and the cradle of the hymn, or the cradle hymn as the first children's poem. So if we have Comenius as the first picture book, then we have Isaac as the first children's poem, because he added now a hymn or rhythm to the pieces that he has written for children. Battledore is one of the tool or the write-up shared or developed in the 17th to 18th century. So this succeeded the horn book, and it was a 4 by 6.5 three-leveled cardboard that folded like a pocket book, still has the alphabet and easy writing reading matters, which made it popular more in 1840. Then we have the John Newbery era. So John Newbery class is one of the most famous writer during this time, still from 17th century. And he published the first thought of publishing books solely for children. So two of his written output are the Little Pretty Pocket Book, which is the first book that can be truly called a child's book, and the Mother Goose Melody, or what we call now Mother Goose Rhymes, which is a collection of nursery rhymes published. So John Newbery class is actually called the father of children's literature because he conceived the idea of publishing books for the enjoyment and entertainment of children. Because in the previous periods, diba, literary pieces for children is for instruction, for rules, for lessons, moral lessons, for church. This time, it simply serves the purpose for enjoyment and entertainment for children. Now, what are some of these Mother Goose nursery rhymes or from the Melody of Mother Goose published by John Newbery? I know some of you are familiar of this. These are even taught in or shared in your elementary and kindergarten years or in your childhood years. Some of these are Baba Black Sheep, we also have the Jack and Jill, Humpty Dumpty, Three Blind Mice, Pussycat, Pussycat. So, um the Mother Goose rhymes are actually class shared or developed in the earliest time or the history of children's literature for the purpose of um, stating the view of the writer about the situation of the certain society. So if we if we try to know better or deeper the thoughts about the different rhymes, this seems to have derived from the name Mother Goose, from the idea of Charles Perrault's fairy tales, and it talks about the expression of an individual of the writer, I mean, to what is happening in the society. The idea of Mother Goose or Mother Goose in its original term is a fictitious old woman, which is reputedly the source of the body of traditional children's songs and verses known as the nursery rhyme. So she is often pictured as a big-nosed, sharp-chinned elderly woman riding on the back of a flying gander. And this Mother Goose was first associated with nursery rhymes in the early collection of the most celebrated songs and lullabies in old British nurses. So this Mother Goose melody or sonnets for the cradle published the successors of one of the first publishers of the children's books, John Newbery. So what is the importance or how can a child or how does a child develop through the use of the Mother Goose rhymes or through introduction of the Mother Goose rhymes? So these are some of the importance in child's development. So for cognitive, it learns the alphabet or the a child can learn the alphabet, numbers and counting. For the aesthetics, it nurtures the love for sounds and rhythms and sensitivity to patterns in art. And then for social and physical, most rhymes are actually are called cooperative plays. They even have rhythms. And you or a child can state the rhyme along with the other children. Okay, so you have experienced reciting the rhymes in your childhood years. So these are actually just some or few of the nursery rhymes shared by or published by John Newbery. Let us proceed to the didactic period. So the didactic period is known for its contribution by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is a French philosopher who started a new philosophy in the education for children. If we say didactic period class, didactic literature, it presents philosophical, religious, moral, and scientific knowledge and ideas in various imaginative literary genre. So here comes now the different genre of literature. So Rousseau wrote Emily uh, as a piece on one of its famous piece in the didactic period, and it's this piece of Rousseau or Rousseau's Emily is a kind of a half treatise or half novel that tells the life story of a fictional man named Emily. So in it, Rousseau traces the course of Emily's development and the education he receives an education designed to create in him all the virtues of Rousseau's idealized natural man, which is uncorrupted by the modern society. So, according to Rousseau class, the natural goodness of a man can be nurtured and maintained only according to this highly prescriptive model of education. And Rousseau states that his aim in Emily, in that piece, is to outline that model, a model that differed sharply from all accepted forms of the time. Rousseau also, Rousseau's idea of Emily, or idea of the piece Emily, is to simply give importance of education in order for an individual to learn about about life, or about the things that is happening in his or her society. So he wrote the Emily that embodies the philosophy that children be given freedom to develop their natural interests and to learn from actual experiences. Then here is also the other piece in the didactic period, which is written by Thomas Day, um, the history of Sanford and Merton. The history of Sanford and Merton class follows the reformation of Tommy Merton, who is transformed from a spoiled 6-year-old boy into a virtuous gentleman. So that's the idea, the thought about the history of Sanford and Merton. Um, that in this piece, they defines virtue as the appreciation of the value of labor. So there are two awards actually, class. There are two main award. There are two main award. There is a main award, or prestigious award given to the writers during this period, and this is of course named after John Newbery, the Newbery Award. So it is given, or that's awarded to any authors writing for children's book and has contributed a lot in the period, the didactic period, and even until now. So the Peter Parley books is another piece written during the didactic period, talks about the history of the world. So this is an informational book about countries of the world and about its wonders of science and historical figures of the different countries. So these are some of the famous contributions in the didactic period. Then came the return of fairy tales, old and the new. So one of the most common, if we talk about fairy tales, class, diba, these are stories that tells about fantasies and happy ever after. So the oldest fairy tales actually are written by Grimm's, or we have Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, who collected the old German stories not for the entertainment of children but to record them scientifically for prosperity. So these stories were translated into English in 1823 and were called Grimm's Popular Stories. So these are the oldest. This is the oldest collection of popular stories, which are fairy tale stories. In the time of the return of the fairy tales for the old and the new. So the influence of didacticism during the didactic period was unable to control permanently children's love for fairy tales, and the publication of Grimm's fairy tales revived the interest for the imaginative stories. Okay, so Jim's Fairy Tales class are classics and influential collection of folklore by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, and it's first published in two volumes as Kinder and Children's and Household Tales, and the later revised and enlarged 7 times between 1819 and 1857. So the work was first translated into English as German Popular and has since been translated under numerous titles already. So, what are these some of the fairy tales common during the time of the return of fairy tales, which has been started by the Grimms? So, some of the popular authors from this time, or from this period, is Christian Andersen. So, just he's one of the most popular authors of our fairy tales, common to our children and to us today. So, He published his fairy tales or collection of fairy tales in 1846, and he was even regarded as the great master of the literary fairy tales. So some of his published fairy tales are The Emperor's New Clothes, The Red Shoes, The Little Mermaid. So it's actually originally written by Hans Christian Andersen. We have Thumbelina. Most of you are familiar with these stories or with these fairy tales. And then we have the Ugly Duckling, the Snow Queen, and the Princess and the Pea. So those are just some of the famous fairy tales written by Christian Andersen, who is known as the great master of the literary fairy tales. Then we have Lear's Book of Nonsense, who is Lear's Edward Lear's Book of Nonsense marked the need for laughter in the normal development of children. He wrote actually the book, or he published the book for for humor. So that's the main purpose of Edward Lear. And then we have Lewis Carroll. I think you are familiar with Lewis Carroll as, again, another famous author in our fairy tale, who was a mathematician professor at the Oxford University and made up stories for a little girl named Alice. So Alice in Wonderland is a very famous or familiar fairy tale to you because this is mostly the popular most popular introduced story for children because it has more than two settings. So the idea of Alice in Wonderland is the adventure of Alice in Wonderland or in the different places. And then this story is actually inspired has given Lewis Carroll the inspiration to write because of its because of that little girl named Alice Liddell, whom Lewis became very fond of. So Alice was so delighted with the stories and she asked Lewis to write them down for her. And then he called his collection of stories Alice in Wonderland. This story was followed by Through the Looking Glass, still the sequel of the Alice in Wonderland. So if you want to read about that, or later on, we will have a discussion on the elements of Alice in Wonderland, and then we will know the story. What is this story all about? Or some of you may share based on what you have seen in movie or but what you have read in the books. Then let us proceed to the realistic literature period. So, literary realism class is a literary movement that presents reality by portraying mundane, everyday experiences as they are in the real life. It depicts familiar people, places, and stories, primarily about the middle and lower classes of society. So, literary realism seeks to tell a story as truthfully as possible instead of dramatizing romanticizing the piece. So this period was marked with the appearance of stories of boys and girls in simple home situations, stories of adventure, of brave men and women, history and growth of the countries, and the wonders of nature and science. So the best example of realistic story class was Louisa M. Alcott's Little Woman in 1868. This is a story of four little girls with their pretty quarrels and their courage and their affection for one another. And this was followed by Little Men, of course, which is of course the stories of the three little boys. So I think these are just some of the most important or common contributions during the realistic literature. But later on, we will discuss or we will share or I'll introduce to you the different pieces that talks about realistic literature. So that is all about the history of children's literature throughout the world.